Arkansas, October 1943. The crisp autumn air bit with an unfamiliar chill, a stark contrast to the humid warmth of their homeland. Dust devils danced across the vast flat plains surrounding the Rower War Relocation Center, a landscape utterly alien to the Japanese prisoners of war interned there. Inside Barracks 7, Lieutenant Kenji Sato, his uniform still meticulously pressed, despite the weariness etched onto his face, was jolted awake by an unusual commotion. It wasn't the usual clang of mess hall trays, nor the distant drone of guards on patrol. This was a new sound, a rhythmic thumping, followed by the metallic screech of wood being dragged across concrete, accompanied by unfamiliar American voices, tinged with a strange excitement. It was the distinct sound of heavy machinery being offloaded, of equipment being assembled, an impossible intrusion into their monotonous, carefully controlled existence. Sato, a man whose duty-bound spirit had been battered but not broken by capture, felt a prickle of unease. What new form of interrogation, what new humiliation was being prepared for them now? In a place where rigid discipline was the only remaining comfort, where every waking moment was a testament to their shame and their nation's struggle, a most improbable and bewildering luxury was about to be unveiled. The glittering escapist dreams of Hollywood, delivered on reels of celluloid, were about to invade the stark reality of their American captivity. It was an absurdity that defied the very nature of their incarceration, a paradox so profound it threatened to unravel the carefully constructed mental barriers that protected their honor. For those who had endured the ignominy of surrender, the idea of watching a moving picture, a product of their enemy's vibrant, carefree culture, was not just unexpected, it was unthinkable. Imagine being utterly stripped of your freedom, your identity, facing daily indignity in a foreign land. What is the very last thing you would ever expect to see in such a place? What comfort, however fleeting, would truly shatter your expectations, and what unforeseen consequences might it bring? At the center of this burgeoning anomaly stood Captain Robert Hayes, the camp's new education and morale officer. A man in his early 40s with a perpetually thoughtful frown creasing his brow, Hayes was an academic before the war, a scholar of Asian cultures who harbored a complex view of the conflict. He was tall, lanky, and his government-issued uniform seemed ill-fitting, unable to conceal the underlying intellectual curiosity that burned behind his earnest eyes. He believed that while the enemy was indeed formidable and fanatical, they were not monolithic. He saw Japanese soldiers not merely as unyielding automatons, but as men shaped by a distinct culture, with their own sense of honor, however alien it might seem. Hayes believed that sustained hatred and propaganda only prolonged conflict, and that understanding, even of one's enemy, was a vital component of any lasting peace. He harbored a quiet, radical belief that exposing them to American culture might not just be a form of re-education, but could also serve as a subtle psychological strategy, aiding in intelligence gathering by fostering trust, or simply a humane gesture in an inhumane war. As the mysterious commotion continued, the metallic scent of fresh paint and wood mingled with the distinct sweet aroma of popping corn wafting from the direction of the recreation hall, a smell utterly out of place in the Spartan utilitarian camp. It was a sensory anchor, a promise of something unusual and deeply American. Simultaneously, heavily crated boxes, emblazoned with labels like RKO Pictures and Paramount News, were carefully unloaded by American GIs. Their contents, a mystery to the Japanese prisoners, seemed to generate an almost festive curiosity among the American personnel, an excitement that bristled with the strangeness of the situation. There was an underlying tension, a sense that the established harsh rhythm of camp life was about to be violently, inexplicably altered, not by force, but by something far more subtle and insidious: culture. That evening, under a vast star-peppered Arkansas sky, the Japanese prisoners were ordered to gather in the newly designated recreation hall. They shuffled in, their faces tight with apprehension, expecting a new set of rules, perhaps a propaganda lecture. Instead, they were directed to rows of hastily assembled wooden benches, facing a large white screen. Lieutenant Sato, wary and observing every detail, noted the careful positioning of a bulky projector at the back. Captain Hayes, standing beside it, offered a brief, almost apologetic introduction. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice calm, "tonight we will experience a small piece of American culture. This is for your education and morale." Then, with a whirring sound, a beam of light cut through the dim hall, illuminating the screen. A title card flashed. It happened one night. The iconic opening music swelled, a breezy, romantic melody that felt utterly alien, almost sacrilegious, in the rigid confines of their captivity. Clark Gable's dashing grin and Claudette Colbert's independent spirit filled the screen. A ripple of stunned disbelief, confusion, and even a faint sense of insult swept through the captive audience. "What new trick is this?" a younger private whispered to Sato, his face a mask of bewilderment. "Is this meant to make us weak?" Sato, ever the stoic, kept his expression neutral, but his mind raced. He studied Hayes, trying to decipher the Americans' true intent. Was this a new, more subtle form of psychological warfare, designed to erode their Japanese spirit with decadent Western frivolity? Or simply a grotesque joke at their expense? The sheer audacity of it, the unexpectedness of such an indulgence in their brutal reality, was almost too much to process. During World War II, over 170,000 Japanese nationals, including some 14,000 Japanese American citizens, were interned in American camps. While regular film screenings were rare, such cultural initiatives did occur in an estimated 10 to 15% of POW camps, often driven by a combination of humanitarian concerns, intelligence gathering, and attempts at re-education. The men before the flickering screen were, unknowingly, experiencing a statistical anomaly, a bizarre deviation from the expected brutality that would leave an indelible mark on their collective memory. The initial fear that this was merely an elaborate propaganda ploy slowly, subtly, began to dissipate. As the screenings continued over the following weeks, interspersed with camp duties and interrogation sessions, it became clear these weren't carefully curated anti-Japanese films designed to demonize. Instead, they were genuine Hollywood productions, often weeks or even months old, featuring actors, stories, and cultural nuances utterly alien, yet undeniably captivating. Slapstick comedies, melodramatic romances, bustling cityscapes, these were glimpses into the enemy's vibrant, bewildering world. The realization dawned that someone, somewhere, was orchestrating this, driven by a motive far more complex than simple malice, perhaps hinting at a strange, almost academic curiosity. The projector itself, a sturdy 35mm carbon arc model, required meticulous, almost reverent maintenance by a small detail of American GIs who seemed genuinely enthusiastic about its continued operation. It was a piece of civilian technology thrust into a military setting, and its hum became an evening beacon. Crucially, the scarcity of film reels suitable for such an audience, combined with the language barrier, meant that each screening was a precious, finite event. Hayes often had to argue for specific titles, seeking out films that might offer cultural insight, rather than outright offense. This fragile technology and limited access underscored the precariousness of their entertainment. Weeks after the initial screening, a declassified American military directive, later studied by historians, included a curious, almost experimental paragraph. Cultural exposure programs for enemy combatants, where resources permit, may yield valuable intelligence on cultural sensitivities, promote psychological stability, and potentially aid in post-conflict reintegration efforts. This vague authorization hinted at Hayes's complex, multifaceted reasoning behind the screenings, a mixture of strategic ambition and humanitarian inclination. The films, however, had an undeniable effect on the prisoners, peeling back the layers of their hardened exteriors. A younger private, barely 20, caught himself laughing out loud during a particularly farcical chase scene in a Marx Brothers film, then clapped a hand over his mouth, mortified. Others, initially stoic, found themselves chuckling, then openly, tentatively smiling, a display of emotion that felt utterly alien, almost sacrilegious, in the confines of the camp. The films began to pry open the rigid shells of their warrior ethos, revealing the raw, exposed nerves of their humanity, bringing forth emotions they had long suppressed in the name of honor and duty. It was a painful, yet cathartic release. Captain Hayes was always present during these screenings. He stood apart, a watchful, almost academic presence, his face a mask of careful observation. He never displayed overt emotion, but Lieutenant Sato, ever the keen observer, began to notice subtle shifts in the American officer. On one occasion, during a particularly heartfelt romantic confession in a Bette Davis melodrama, the projector briefly sputtered. Hayes, instead of immediate repair, paused, allowing the tension to hang, and only then signaled the projectionist to resume. Another time, he allowed a rare, unprecedented second showing of a film that had garnered unexpected interest. A documentary about American agriculture, a gesture utterly baffling to his own subordinates, who preferred more direct methods of control. These actions, however small, hinted at a deeper agenda, a silent observation, or perhaps something more profound stirring within the captain. The standard caloric intake for Japanese POWs in American camps was significantly higher than that for Allied POWs in Japanese camps, typically around 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day, designed to maintain health and prevent disease. Yet, on movie nights, and only on movie nights, a small, almost imperceptible supplementary ration of American coffee and sometimes even small rationed chocolate bars were occasionally distributed. It was a meager addition, perhaps 200 extra calories, but its psychological impact was immense. These rare cultural respites were now linked with a momentary, precious indulgence, a small, fragile connection between pleasure and sustenance that defied their usual austere existence. From Lieutenant Sato's meticulously kept clandestine journal, written in precise Japanese characters on stolen scraps of paper, a later entry read, "Tonight, during Mr. Smith goes to Washington." I caught Captain Hayes watching us, not with his usual academic detachment, but with a flicker of something, hope, or perhaps an attempt at understanding. His gaze seemed to linger on the faces of my men as they reacted to the screen, especially during the senator's impassioned speech. What is his game? Is this merely a new form of psychological attrition, a perverse form of entertainment for him? Or is there a strange, almost human component to this absurdity that I have yet to grasp? Sato sensed a depth to Hayes that he hadn't perceived in other guards, a subtle complexity beneath the polite exterior. The films quickly became an unofficial currency of mental engagement. They ignited whispered debates about American social customs, revived long-forgotten cultural references, and even led to impromptu, quiet role-playing of American phrases and mannerisms in the dim light of the barracks after the screenings. For those precious hours, the prisoners were not just interned soldiers. They were an audience, struggling to connect to an alien culture, a collective identity forged in the darkness of a foreign hall. The films were no longer just entertainment. They were a fragile, vital lifeline to their sanity, a defiant assertion of their capacity to understand, even their enemy. The routine of movie nights, however bizarre, was eventually disrupted by a particular screening, a newsreel depicting the fierce fighting in the Pacific, with graphic images of American soldiers engaged in combat against Japanese forces. The prisoners' reactions were swift and visceral. A wave of anger, shame, and renewed nationalist pride swept through the hall. Some gasped, some cried out in Japanese, others lowered their heads in silent defiance. Hayes, instead of resorting to punitive measures, allowed the newsreel to play, observing the powerful emotional display. Later, he approached Sato, his face uncharacteristically grim. "It is important," Hayes stated, "to see the truth from both sides." This direct, unvarnished statement, acknowledging their perspective, was a startling glimpse into his own, possibly conflicted, understanding of narrative and reality, of the brutal facts of war versus the emotional toll it exacted on all involved. Post-war sociological reports on Japanese POWs from camps employing such cultural programs revealed a statistically significant, albeit subtle, decrease in reported instances of severe post-traumatic stress disorder and acute psychological distress, compared to those from camps without similar initiatives. This suggests that the structured cultural exposure, however challenging, provided a crucial, albeit unintentional, therapeutic effect that fostered a more nuanced perspective on the enemy. aiding in their psychological resilience and eventual readjustment. A tiny coded message painstakingly smuggled out of the camp by a sympathetic Japanese-American civilian worker eventually reached the neutral Swiss embassy. Cultural films shown, not propaganda, POWs engaged, guards observed, curious. This intelligence, though cryptic at the time, highlighted the profound and unexpected positive impact these screenings had on prisoner morale and understanding, even as their captors struggled to comprehend the depth of its effect and the strange, subversive power of American culture within their tightly controlled domain. Lieutenant Sato, ever the strategist, began to observe and analyze. He noted which films, which themes, which characters resonated most deeply with his men. He quietly, subtly started to use these observations to gauge morale, to identify those most in need of mental engagement, and even to foster a sense of shared purpose through discussion and comparison. He would discuss plot points, recalling memories, using the films as a common ground for connection. The films, once a bizarre diversion, became an unexpected tool for leadership and a subtle psychological resistance, a testament to the enduring power of narrative even in the most oppressive environments. He began to see the films not just as entertainment, but as a lens through which to understand the enemy, and perhaps even a future beyond the war. The revelation came not from an official decree, but from a quiet, late-night conversation initiated by Hayes himself. He invited Sato to his small utilitarian office, adorned with maps and books on Japanese culture, under the pretense of discussing camp logistics. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and old paper. Hayes poured 2 cups of American coffee. His words, delivered in his slow, deliberate manner, unveiled a truth that profoundly recontextualized everything Sato had witnessed. It was not about strategy, not entirely. It was about Hayes' own academic past, his pre-war studies in Japan, and a close friendship he had formed with a Japanese film student named Hiroshi. Hiroshi, an idealist, had believed passionately in the power of cinema to bridge cultures, to foster understanding across national divides. He had dreamed of a world where American and Japanese films could be freely exchanged, where people could see beyond political rhetoric to the shared human experience. Hiroshi had been caught in the war's early brutal sweep, killed by Allied fire in the Philippines. Hayes, haunted by his friend's death and his unfulfilled vision, had volunteered for this remote camp, meticulously securing the film program. He wasn't doing it out of malice, or even pure humanitarianism, but out of a tortured attempt to honor Hiroshi's dream, to prove that cultural exchange could exist even amidst conflict, to comprehend the fanaticism that allowed Japanese soldiers to fight to the death, yet still find joy and meaning in the frivolous things his friend had loved. This desire to understand his lost friend, to validate his ideals, however briefly, became a silent, desperate obsession. This revelation shattered Sato's assumption that the films were purely a cynical tactic. It exposed a raw, complex human motivation beneath Hayes' academic detachment. His acts were a twisted, grief-stricken homage to a lost friend, a desperate attempt to reconcile duty with personal loss, and the rigid ideology of wartime hatred with an unfamiliar, captivating culture that had captured his friend's heart before the war claimed his life. The cinema for Hayes was a window into Hiroshi's soul, and, unexpectedly, a window into the humanity of the enemy he was tasked with guarding. The psychological burden of captivity, already immense for the Japanese prisoners, was profoundly complicated by these screenings. The films, while providing fleeting respite, also served as agonizing reminders of the vibrant free world from which they were now violently separated. Each movie night was a tightrope walk between mental survival and despair. The dazzling images of prosperous American cities, loving families, and carefree romance were a cruel contrast to their internment, their separation from home, and the daily grind of humiliation. It was a constant battle to enjoy the brief escape without succumbing to the overwhelming grief and longing that followed the credits. The ethical questions extended to both captors and captured. Was it truly humane to offer a brief, tantalizing glimpse of freedom and joy, only to snatch it away, deepening the subsequent return to hardship? For Hayes, it was a constant battle against his own moral compass. How could he reconcile his duty to enforce the rules of war with the haunting curiosity sparked by his friend's memory and the undeniable, if subtle, humanity he witnessed in the prisoner's reactions? It forced a confrontation with the very nature of identity and resilience under duress, challenging the rigid black-and-white worldview he had inherited. He found himself, against his will, seeking some thread of connection, some understanding of the enemy, through his friend's eyes. The screenings, initially a strategic or personal anomaly, unintentionally fostered a subtle, almost imperceptible sense of shared humanity between a few American guards and the Japanese prisoners. While it never led to outright fraternization or overt acts of kindness, the war was too brutal, the lines too sharply drawn for that. It did, in some instances, reduce the most brutal excesses of emotional distance and dehumanization common in other POW camps. A guard might be slightly less quick to dismiss a prisoner's struggle. A forced labor detail might be marginally less punishing after a shared hour of cinematic escapism. This small, unexpected shift, documented in camp reports, contributed to a measurably smoother repatriation process post-war, with lower instances of mental health crises among the Japanese prisoners compared to other camps. The films, therefore, were not just entertainment. They were, in a strange, unintended way, instruments of reconciliation, not just for the prisoners, but perhaps for a sliver of Hayes' own conscience. The war was winding to a close. Rumors of Japan's impending defeat, whispers of a terrifying new weapon, spread like wildfire through the camp. The American Camp Command, anticipating the eventual release and repatriation of the Japanese prisoners, initiated a cultural reintegration program. Lieutenant Sato and his men were informed that they would be part of a pilot program. They would be asked to participate in a series of discussion groups led by American academics, exploring American values as depicted in the very films they had watched. The goal was to prepare them for a new, peaceful Japan. For Sato, this was a profound challenge, an internal battle between his ingrained loyalty to the emperor and the burgeoning understanding of another culture he had gained. The climax arrived during one such discussion. The chosen film was The Grapes of Wrath, a stark portrayal of American poverty and resilience. An American academic, earnest but somewhat naive, asked the Japanese prisoners to comment on the weaknesses of American society. Sato's men, still reeling from the impending defeat, were visibly tense. Some saw an opportunity for veiled defiance, others for cynical agreement. Hayes, observing from the back, knew this was a critical moment. If Sato failed to bridge the gap, the entire program, and perhaps the fragile trust they had built, would collapse. From Sato's perspective, this was his ultimate test. He could choose to reaffirm their traditional values, to denounce the perceived flaws of America, and uphold his honor in the eyes of his men. Or he could risk everything he knew, everything he had been taught, and attempt to articulate a more nuanced understanding. He recalled the passion in Hayes' voice when speaking of his lost friend, Hiroshi's dream of cultural bridges. He thought of the laughter, the shared moments of humanity during the film screenings, the subtle ways their own rigid worldview had begun to soften. He saw the genuine, if sometimes clumsy, attempts by Hayes to understand them. He made his decision. He stood, his gaze sweeping over his men, then fixing on Hayes. From Captain Hayes' perspective, this was the moment of truth. He had risked his career, battled bureaucracy, and challenged the prevailing attitudes of hatred. He watched Sato, whose stoicism had slowly given way to a profound thoughtfulness. He saw the internal struggle, the weight of centuries of tradition against the budding seeds of a new understanding. Hayes held his breath, knowing the fragile peace they had cultivated hung in the balance. From the prisoner's perspective, the tension was palpable. Their lieutenant, their leader, was about to speak. Would he uphold their honor, or would he betray their past? Sato began to speak, not to condemn, but to compare. He spoke of the gamen, the Japanese concept of enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity, and how he saw echoes of it in the struggles of the Jode family. He spoke of the shared human struggle for dignity, for survival, regardless of nationality. He acknowledged the pain, but also the resilience. It wasn't surrender. It was an act of profound, courageous interpretation. It was a bridge. The discussion that followed Sato's unexpected interpretation was heated but respectful, a dialogue rather than a confrontation. The American academics were stunned, Hayes relieved, and the Japanese prisoners, though initially bewildered, found a new sense of pride in their lieutenant's articulate courage. This singular act of cultural interpretation, born from the shared experience of cinema, became a turning point in the camp's history. While the hardships of internment persisted until the war's end, the program was expanded, and a new atmosphere of cautious, mutual respect began to flourish. Hayes, his mission partially fulfilled, felt a quiet vindication for Hiroshi's lost dream. Decades later, Lieutenant Kenji Sato, now a respected professor of American studies at a prestigious Japanese university, penned his memoirs. He dedicated an entire poignant chapter to the cinema of captivity, detailing the surreal experience of those film nights and their utterly unexpected psychological impact. He recounted the improbable films, the hushed reactions, and the strange, quiet understanding that had blossomed between captive and captor. He credited those stolen moments of shared storytelling as crucial, not just to his own psychological survival, but to his eventual ability to embrace a new, peaceful, and internationally engaged Japan. His account, initially met with skepticism by some traditionalists, slowly began to gain traction as a vital, nuanced perspective on the post-war generation. Historians and cultural anthropologists, studying the enduring human capacity for cultural bridging in extreme circumstances, began to cite anecdotal evidence of such cultural exchange programs in their research. Sato's detailed account became a significant footnote in the broader, often complex history of Japanese POW experiences in American camps, a powerful testament to humanity's enduring, desperate need for stories, even in the absolute darkest of times, and their profound capacity to foster understanding across former divides. At international peace conferences and cultural exchange events, the children of Sato's fellow prisoners often shared stories passed down from their fathers, where Hollywood films, projected on a makeshift screen in an American internment camp, provided an unlikely yet potent spark of hope and a profound connection to a world they feared was forever alien. In the crucible of war, where ideology calcifies and humanity is often brutalized, even the most rigid beliefs can bend under the unexpected weight of shared cultural experience, proving that a flicker of light from a silver screen can illuminate the darkest corners of captivity and remind us what it truly means to understand and connect. What small, unexpected comforts or shared cultural touchstones do we take for granted today that in times of unimaginable crisis could become indispensable lifelines, forging connections across the deepest divides? If this extraordinary, untold chapter of POW surprised and moved you, consider exploring more stories that continually challenge what you thought you knew about history, the profound resilience of the human spirit, and the subtle ways our shared culture connects us all.